In the dry summer of 1952, Della Rourke, a lean woman of 27, walked 600 sheep back and forth across a stand of ripening dryland wheat that the whole of Pelican Valley had already written off as trampled and ruined, and by the time the men at the Kestrel feed store had finished the morning pot of coffee, the valley had a name for her. They called her the Sheep Woman. And they laughed about it for 2 full seasons, right up until the morning the Mormon crickets came down off the rimrock like a gray judgment and stripped every clean-tended field for 30 miles to bare stalk and dust. Every field but hers. She had not lost her reason, whatever the men leaning on the counter chose to believe. She had read a thing set down in a dead woman's hand, penciled small in a book bound in cracked oilcloth, and it was a thing not one of those cattlemen had ever sat still long enough to read. That is the whole shape of it, and it does no good hiding the ending from a listener who has already guessed it. What cannot be guessed? What took the Valley more than 2 years to learn and took the State Agricultural College the better part of a decade to write down properly is the how of it. How a flock of sheep, driven at the right hour across a field of standing grain, could stand between a family and ruin in the year the crickets came. That is the part worth sitting still for. She was not a large woman. She stood maybe 5.5 feet in the flat-heeled boots she wore into the field, and she was lean in a manner a person gets lean from work rather than from want, all cord and tendon in the forearms, her shoulders squared under a man's canvas coat that had belonged to her husband before the influenza took him in the bad winter 3 years past. Her hair was the pale gold of cured grass, and she kept it in a single braid down her back that the sun had bleached lighter than the rest, and there were fine lines already starting at the corners of her eyes from squinting into the high country light. Her hands were what a person noticed first, if a person noticed hands. They were large-knuckled and brown, and the palms had gone hard and smooth as saddle leather, and she had a habit of holding perfectly still with those hands resting on the wool of a ewe's back, reading the animal through her fingers, so that she looked older and steadier than her years. She never ran at sheep. A person who runs at sheep, her grandmother had told her once, is a person who has already lost the argument. The land she worked sat on the dry east side of Pelican Valley, up where the good bottom ground gave out and the sagebrush flats began their long climb toward the rimrock. It was hard country to love and harder to farm. The rain came when it pleased, which in most years was not enough, and in some years was not at all. And a man could break his heart and his back, both trying to raise a wheat crop on ground that God had plainly meant for antelope and cheatgrass. Her husband had loved it anyway, with the stubbornness of one who has put too much of himself into a thing to leave it, and when he died, she found that she loved it too, or at least that she could not bring herself to sell it to the bank and go back down the valley to keep house for her sister's family in town. So she stayed. She stayed with a mortgage note she could barely carry, a band of sheep the whole county thought was a fool's animal for that country, and a field of wheat she meant to do a thing to that would make her the joke of every feed store and cafe from the rimrock to the river. If you have ever watched a whole valley make up its mind that a steady, capable person had gone strange, if you happen to have been the one they made up their minds about, then you already understand something about why this channel exists and why these stories are worth the telling. Stay with Della. Stay with her clear to the rimrock and the gray tide and the morning the men came to the fence with their hats in their hands, because the getting there is the entire story, and she earned every mile. Now, what it was she meant to do. The orthodoxy of that valley, the belief that every man held as surely as he held his own name, was that sheep were hoofed ruin. Everybody agreed on it. The cattlemen agreed on it loudest, because cattle were what a serious man ran in that country, and sheep were what you ran if you were poor or foreign or a woman alone. But even the few men who kept a little band for the wool and the mutton agreed that you did not, under any circumstances a sane man could imagine, turn sheep loose onto a field of standing wheat. Sheep ate everything. Sheep pulled the plant up by the roots. Sheep packed the ground down hard as a road with those little cloven feet until nothing could push up through it. A wheat crop was a delicate and expensive thing, coaxed out of that dry ground with more prayer than water, and the notion of walking 600 of the woolly little wreckers back and forth across it when the grain was up and heading out and only weeks from harvest struck the coffee drinkers at the Kestrel as so plainly insane that they did not even bother to argue her out of it. They just laughed. It was, they agreed, the best entertainment the valley had seen since the banker's automobile went through the ice on the reservoir. You kept your wheat clean, that was the wisdom. You kept the weeds down with a harrow and a hoe, and in those years, with the new chemicals, the county extension office was pushing hard. The sprays that came in the drums with the skull on the label. You kept the livestock off the crop ground entirely, behind good fence, and you ran your cattle on the range and your wheat in the fields, and never the two together, because that was how it was done, and how it had always been done, and how the fathers of these men had done it before them. A person who mixed the two up, who ran a flock through a wheat field on purpose, was either ignorant of the first principles of farming or had lost the thread of her reason. And Della Rourke was not ignorant. Everybody knew she had grown up on the same hard ground, had helped her own people run sheep on the summer range since she was old enough to sit a horse. So it had to be the other thing. It had to be grief, they decided, kindly enough at first. The poor woman had lost her man, and now she had lost her sense. And it was a shame, and somebody ought to keep an eye on her before she starved herself off that dry section entirely. What none of them knew, what she did not trouble to tell them, was that everything she was about to do had been written down in pencil more than 50 years before. In a small book bound in oilcloth, gone cracked and brown with age, in the hand of a woman who had walked sheep across the high-grain country of a place none of these men could have found on a map, her grandmother. The old woman they had never met, dead now these 11 years, who had come across the ocean as a girl with that book already half filled, and who spent her long life adding to it in a small, crabbed pencil script, half in English and half in the old Basque tongue that Della could no longer fully read but could sound out in pieces, like a child. That book lay on the kitchen table under the window right now, held flat by a smooth river stone, open to a page the dead woman had marked with a strip of red flannel. And what was set down on that page was the reason 600 sheep were about to walk across a field of wheat that the whole valley had already buried. But that comes later. First there is the matter of how a young woman came to have such a book at all, and why she trusted a dead woman's pencil over the whole living wisdom of Pelican Valley. Her grandmother's name was Amaya, and she had been a shepherd in the old country before she was anything else. Not a shepherd's wife, a shepherd. In the mountains where she came from, Della had been told, the girls went up to the high pastures with the bands the same as the boys, and a woman might spend the whole green half of the year alone with 1,000 head and 2 dogs and a stone hut. and she learned the sheep as other people learned to read, which is to say, early and completely and for life. Amaya had crossed the ocean as a young woman to marry a man of her own people who had a sheep outfit in the Basin country, and when that man died young, as men so often did in that country, she ran the outfit herself for 30 years and buried 2 more husbands besides, and raised the children, and kept, all the while, the little oilcloth book. Into it she put everything. The weather of every year. How heavy the lambs came off the range. Which ewes threw twins and which threw runts. Where the good feed came up early and where the poison weed grew and had to be walked around. And, folded in among all of that, the things she had learned about the ground itself, and about the creatures that lived in the ground, and about how a moving flock passing across a piece of country changed that country in ways a man on a horse 200 feet up would never see. Della had been the one of all the grandchildren who sat still for the old woman. She had been a solemn, watchful child, the kind that adults forget is in the room, and she spent whole winter afternoons at Amaya's knee while the grandmother turned the pages of the book and talked, half to the child and half to herself, in the 2 languages braided together. Most of it had gone over the child's head at the time, but some of it lodged, as things lodge in a child who is truly listening, and years later, married and widowed and standing on her own dry section, with the bank breathing down her neck, Della went up to the attic of her sister's house in town and dug through the trunk of the dead woman's things until she found it. The oilcloth book. And she brought it home and cleaned the mouse dirt off the cover and sat down at her kitchen table and began, slowly, painfully, sounding out the old words, to read it. She remembered one afternoon out of all those winter afternoons more clearly than the rest, and it came back to her often that first hard summer. She had been perhaps 8. The old shepherd had the book open on her knee and was not reading from it, but looking out the window at the snow, and Della, bold for once, had asked her why the men down the valley did not run their sheep in their wheat if it worked so well. The grandmother had laughed, a short sound with no meanness in it. Because a man believes his own eyes, Amaya said, in her heavy, careful English, and his eyes tell him the sheep eat the wheat. It is true, his eyes are not wrong. The sheep would eat the wheat by day, when it stands up dry and tall. So he keeps the sheep out, and he is right. And he is also a fool, because he never once rose before dawn to see what the wheat does before the sun and what the sheep does before the sun. A man will not get up in the dark to be proved wrong. He would rather sleep and be right. She had tapped the book. This is not clever, little one. There is nothing clever here. It is only that I got up in the dark 10,000 mornings and looked and wrote what I saw, and they did not. That is the entire secret. Rising in the black before dawn and looking. Anyone could have it. Almost no one wants it. Then, Amaya had said the thing the child did not understand for 20 years, the thing that came back to Della whole one night at her own kitchen table with the banknote past due. They will laugh at you, Amaya had said, not as a warning, just a plain report of how the world goes. If you ever do this thing where people can see, they will laugh, and they will call you a name. And the name will hurt you more than the laughing. And you will want to answer them. Do not answer them. You cannot win with your mouth against a man who has decided. Let the ground answer. The ground does not argue. The ground only shows in the hard year, and the hard year always comes. The child had nodded without understanding, and the old woman had gone back to looking at the snow. And that had been that. But the words had lodged, all of them, and Della had not known they were even in her until the summer she needed them, and then they came up out of her like water out of broken crust, and she understood at last that her grandmother had not only left her a method, she had left her the courage to survive the method's price. That was the winter she came to the page with the red flannel marker. Amaya had headed the page, in English, with 2 words. Della had read them 100 times by now. 2 words underlined twice, pressed so hard with the pencil that she could feel the letters raised on the back of the sheet with her fingertip. She would not say those 2 words aloud to a single soul in Pelican Valley. Not yet. Because a thing said too soon is a thing thrown away, and she meant to let the ground say it for her. But she read them to herself every morning that spring, sitting there with her coffee going cold and the first gray light coming up beyond the rock, and they were the reason she did what she did. Below the 2 words in the crabbed pencil was a set of diagrams. Little sketches of a field seen from above, and across the field a series of arrows, and beside the arrows notes on the timing of it. When to move the band and when to hold it. How many head to the acre and for how long. The hour of the morning it must be done, and why. And down at the bottom of the page, in the old tongue, 3 lines that Della could sound out but only half understand. That seemed to speak of the ground itself, of something that slept in the earth and could be woken or could be kept sleeping depending. She did not fully grasp those 3 lines. She grasped enough. She understood that her grandmother had done this thing, over there across the ocean and again in the basin, and that it worked. And that the reason it worked had to do with the weeds in the crust of the soil and the shallow earth where certain creatures laid their eggs. And she understood one more thing, which was that a woman who trusted her grandmother's 50 years over a feed store full of men who had never once been hungry enough to try something new might just save her farm. So in the early spring of that year she began. The wheat came up green and thin as it always did on that ground. And where the wheat was thin the weeds came up thick, the mustard and the cheatgrass and the Russian thistle that would be tumbleweed by fall, and any other year she would have gone at them with the hoe and the harrow and worn herself to the bone doing it. This year she did not. This year she waited, and she watched the wheat, and when it had put up its first true leaves and set its crown low against the ground, as winter wheat will, she opened the gate between the sheep range and the wheat field, and she and the 2 dogs moved 600 sheep in among the young grain. The men found out about it within the week. There are no secrets in a valley like that. And the laughing started at the Kestrel counter on a Tuesday morning, and it started, as most of the valley's laughing started, with a big bald man named Halloran. Halloran ran the counter at the feed store and had run it 3 decades now, and a feed store counter in a small valley is a kind of throne. Every man who farmed or ranched in that country came through his door. He weighed their seed and sold them their wire and their salt and their poison spray, and he heard everything and passed on most of it. And a word from Halloran could make a young man's reputation or unmake it. He was not a cruel man exactly. He was a man who had found early in life that the surest road to feeling large was to make another person feel small, and had never troubled to unlearn it, and Della Rourke and her sheep were the finest material he had been handed in years. You hear what the Rourke widow's gone and done now, Halloran said that Tuesday, weighing out twine for a rancher named Pell, and he did not trouble to wait for an answer. I heard something, Pell said. Didn't credit it. Credit it. Halloran leaned his forearms on the counter and let his voice carry to the 3 or 4 men warming themselves by the stove. turned her whole sheep band into the wheat. The standing wheat, mind you. 600 head walking through a crop that's near ready to cut. Says she does it before daylight. He straightened up and spread his hands, a man presenting a wonder. Before daylight, boys, so the Lord himself won't have to watch. The men by the stove laughed, and one of them, an old rancher named Teague, shook his head slow and said it was a pure shame. A woman with good ground running it into the dirt like that, and Halloran said it was worse than a shame, it was a comedy, and that a man could sell tickets. And that morning, at that counter, the name was born. Halloran said at first, tried it out like a man trying a new hat. The Sheep Woman. It fit, and it stuck, and by the end of the week a stranger passing through and asking directions to the Rourke place would be told, with a wink, that he meant the Sheep Woman's place. Up east, you could not miss it, just follow the smell and the sound of the whole valley laughing. Della heard about the laughing second-hand, in the small mean pieces that travel. The clerk at the Kestrel, a decent young fellow named Ivers, who weighed out her twine and did not laugh, told her plainly one day that Halloran had been at it again. "He does a whole routine now, Miss Rourke," Ivers said, low, glancing at the door. "I won't repeat it. It isn't fit." He wrapped her twine and pushed it across the counter and would not take her money until she made him. "For what it's worth," he said, "my grandfather ran sheep and cattle both on the same ground up in the breaks, and he did all right, and everybody laughed at him too." "What happened to him?" Della asked. "Died rich," Ivers said, and nobody could ever remember why they'd laughed. And that was the first kind word she had gotten from a living soul in that valley about the thing she was doing. And she carried it home like a coal in a mitten, and it lasted her a good while. Once, driving her old truck through town at a speed well under the posted limit because the tires were worn slick and money for tires was money she did not have, she passed the open door of the Kestrel store, and the laughter came out of it, the big, easy laughter of men with nothing to fear. And Halloran's bald head turned in the doorway to watch her truck go by, and he said something over his shoulder, and the laughter came again. She drove on. She neither slowed nor sped up. She had decided that winter over the lamplit book that she would not spend a single word arguing with men who would not be argued with, and that she would let the ground make her case in its own time. And she held to that decision as she held to everything, which was completely. But it would be a lie to say it did not cost her. That night she sat at the table with the oilcloth book open under the lamp and read those 2 heavy pencil words at the top of the marked page again, and she read the 3 lines of old country writing that she only half understood. And she spoke aloud to the empty kitchen, to her grandmother, to her dead husband, to God. "I hope you were right," she said. "I have bet the whole place on you, and there is no calling it back now." The lamp hissed. The dog stirred by the stove. Nobody answered her, which is how such prayers are usually answered, and after a while she blew out the lamp and went to bed. There was another man, and he mattered more than Halloran, and his manner was the opposite of Halloran's in every particular, which is exactly why he was the more dangerous of the two. His name was Ansel Croft, and he ran a big cattle outfit that wrapped around 3 sides of Della's section like a hand closing. Croft did not laugh at her. He was too smooth a man for laughing. He had wanted her bottom land, the good watered piece down along the coulee where her section touched his, for as long as anyone could remember. First from her husband, and now from her. And he had a patient way about him, circling a thing he wanted over years as a hawk circles, never stooping until the moment was exactly right. He came to her that first summer, always polite, always in his clean, pressed range clothes, his good hat turning slow in his hands. He leaned on her gate one warm evening and told her, in a voice as reasonable as a spring afternoon, how it grieved him to see a woman alone carry such a load. "I have watched the drought take good families all over this valley," Croft said. "Families with a man and grown sons and money in the bank. I would not be a neighbor if I didn't tell you plain, Miss Rourke, that this ground is a hard master for anybody, and hardest of all for a person working it alone." "I have worked it 2 years alone," Della said. "It hasn't killed me yet." "No," Croft said, and he smiled, and the smile was the warmest and most terrible thing about him. "No, it hasn't. But it has a great deal of patience, this country. So do I." He set his hat back on his head. "When the day comes that you find you can't go on," he said, "and I pray it doesn't, but when it comes, you remember that I stand ready to take the burden off you at a fair price. There's no shame in it. Half the good families in this valley have come to the same crossing." And he touched his hat and walked back to his truck, and he never once that first summer said the number he had in mind. The number, she knew from how it moved through the valley, was about a third of what the ground was worth, and it went down every season she struggled, and Ansel Croft was a patient man, and he could wait. His wife was named Ruth. She was a small, quiet woman who had married Croft young and spent 30 years learning exactly what her husband was, and who kept, behind the quiet, a conscience that had not been entirely worn away. She and Della were not friends. The wife of the man trying to take your land cannot easily be your friend. But there had been moments at the church and at the Grange Hall. When Ruth Croft had looked at Della across a room with something in her eyes that was neither pity nor the valley's amusement, and once on the church steps she stopped beside Della and said, very quietly, without quite turning her head, "I don't think you've lost your sense, whatever they say. My own mother's people ran sheep. There was more to them than these men know." And then Halloran's wife came out the door behind them, and Ruth Croft moved off and said no more. But Della understood from that moment that at least one soul in Pelican Valley did not think she had gone strange, and it helped more than the woman could have known. There was a Grange dance at the end of that first summer, the kind of gathering a valley holds when the crops are laid by and there is nothing to do but wait on the weather, and Della went to it, because she had decided early on that she would not hide from the valley and let the valley think it had shamed her indoors. She wore her good dress, and she braided her hair fresh, and she walked into that hall with her chin level. And she felt the room go quiet for half a breath, as a room will when the person everyone has been talking about walks in. Then the fiddle started again and the talk came back up, and she got herself a cup of the church coffee and stood along the wall, and it did not take long for a knot of the feed store men to drift her direction, easy and grinning, with Osgood in the lead, because Osgood was the sort who felt brave in a crowd who never once felt brave alone. "Miss Rourke," Osgood said, too loud so the men behind him could enjoy it, "we've been wondering, do the sheep dance too, or just walk?" A couple of the men laughed. Della sipped her coffee and looked at him over the rim of the cup, unhurried, and let the laugh die on its own before she answered, which took a moment. And the moment did not favor Osgood. "They walk," she said, "mostly at night. You're welcome to come see. Bring a lantern and don't wear your good boots." She said it pleasant as anything, and there was a beat, and then old Teague, of all people, standing at the edge of the knot with a coffee of his own, gave a short, dry bark of a laugh that was plainly not at her, and said, "She's got you there, Osgood." You'd not last an hour walking a band before dawn, and the laugh turned just slightly, just enough, and Osgood colored and muttered something and drifted back to safer water. It was a small thing. But a valley is made of small things, and Della had learned that you did not have to win the argument, you only had to refuse every single time to lose it. And she stood along that wall the rest of the evening, perfectly at ease, and more than one man went home that night a little less sure of the joke than he had been. Ruth Croft found her by the door as the dance broke up. The men were bringing the wagons and the trucks around, and for a moment the two women stood alone in the light of the doorway, and Ruth spoke low and quick, like a person who has only a moment and has been saving up the words. "My husband will offer you a price before the leaves turn," Ruth said. "He always does when he wants a thing. He'll be kind about it. He's kindest when he's taking something." She glanced back into the hall. "I can't tell you not to sell. I don't know your books, and it's not my place. But I'll tell you this, and then I'll go. Whatever it is you're doing out there with those sheep, my mother's mother did something like it, back in the old country, and she was the only one on her mountain who never went hungry, and they called her a witch for it, and she outlived every one of them. She pressed Della's hand once, hard. And then Croft's truck came around, and she was gone, and Della drove home in the dark, turning that over. The only gift anyone had given her all summer, which was the knowledge that she was not the first, and would not be the last, and was not alone even in a hall full of people laughing. Her own sister did not help matters. Her sister lived down in town, married to a decent man who clerked at the bank, and her sister loved her and worried about her and wanted her off that dry section and safe in town where she could be looked after, and love and worry can be as heavy a weight as any mockery. Della drove down to see her that fall, and they sat in the sister's warm kitchen with the children underfoot. And the sister said what she always said. "You could have the back room," her sister said. "The children love you. You could get work at the mercantile, they'd take you tomorrow. You don't have to do this, is what I'm saying. Nobody would think less of you. There's no medal for starving on a hillside because a dead woman wrote you a note." "It isn't a note," Della said. "It's 50 years of watching." And she wasn't a dead woman when she wrote it. She was the smartest person I ever sat beside. "She's a dead woman now," said the sister, not unkindly, "and you're a live one, and I'd like to keep you that way." She reached across and took Della's hard hand in her own soft one. "I hear what they call you, down at the store. I hear it, and it about breaks my heart. And I don't understand why you'll take it when you don't have to." "Because she was right," Della said. "I don't expect you to see it. I hardly see it myself some days. But there is going to come a year, and I've read about it, and I've felt it coming, and when it comes I mean to be standing on that section and not in your back room. That's all. That's the whole of my reason, and I know how it sounds." And the sister looked at her a long moment, and then let go of her hand and got up to see to the children. Because there is a point past which love cannot follow stubbornness, and the two women had reached it years before, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. It is worth telling, before we come to the secret of it, what the daily doing of the thing actually cost her, because the loungers at the feed store counter thought she had found some lazy woman's shortcut, and there was nothing lazy about it at all. She rose in the black before dawn, every dawn of the growing season, while the coyotes were still working the far coulees and the air off the rimrock came down cold enough to ache. She built no fire, and she drank her coffee cold from the night before because there was no time, and she pulled on the canvas coat and the worn boots and went out into the dark to the two dogs already up and quivering at the kennel wire, a rangy black and white bitch called Nan, and a younger dog she was still training who had more heart than sense. She whistled them out low, and the three of them went up through the sage to the range gate in the dark, by feel and long habit, and there she stood a moment in the raw dark and listened to the band before she could see it. 600 head breathing and shifting and tearing at the grass, a sound like a slow sea, and then she opened the gate and sent the dogs wide and began to move them. It was not a thing a person did by main force. She had learned that from the old shepherd before she had learned to read. You did not drive sheep across a wheat field. You floated them across it in a loose, wide front, at a pace no faster than a strolling woman, and you read the band the whole time through your feet and your ears, feeling when it wanted to bunch and heading it off. Feeling when a knot of them started to string out toward the good tall weeds and letting them go there, because the weeds were the point. The dogs did the running. She did the thinking. She would walk the length of that field in the gray with the wet grain soaking her to the knee and her breath smoking in front of her, murmuring the dogs left and right in the low words they knew. And behind her the band would come on across the wheat like a gray fog rolling, and the light would come up slow and pink over the rimrock, and there would be a moment, most mornings, when the sun cleared the rock and struck the dew, and the whole field flashed silver for a few seconds before it went to gold. And in that moment, cold and soaked and bone-tired and mocked by a whole valley, Della Rourke was as near to content as a person gets in this life, because she was doing the thing she was made to do, and she knew it was true even if no one else on earth believed her. She had it timed to the quarter hour. Too early, and the band could not see to graze and would only mill. Too late, and the sun would dry the wheat and stiffen it, and the sheep would start to take the grain along with the weeds. There was a window, a narrow gray window, between the dark and the day, and she hit it every morning, and when the light came full, she pulled the dogs off and gathered the band and put it back through the range gate before the wheat could come to harm. And by the time the men down the valley were pouring their first coffee, she had already done a morning's work that not one of them would have believed possible and would not have believed if they had watched it, because they had decided what they knew. Now here is the part that the men at the counter could not have grasped, because it required a person to get down off the horse and kneel in the dirt and look, which is a thing a proud man will almost never do. Here is what the sheep were actually doing. Della moved the band by the diagram in the book, and the diagram said to move them in the last of the dark before the sun came over the rimrock, when the dew lay heavy on the field and the wheat leaves were wet and tough and cool. She had wondered about that the first time until she watched it happen and understood. In the cool, wet dark, the wheat plant was limber and low and held tight to the earth, its crown of leaves pressed down, and the sheep walking over it and among it did not tear it up. They cropped the weeds instead. The mustard and the thistle stood taller than the wheat and stood dry and did not have the wheat's low crown, and the sheep, moving through in the dim light, took the tops off the weeds and left the grain all but untouched, because a hungry sheep goes for the easy, tall, green thing and not for the tough, low, wet one. By full daylight, the band was back through the range gate and onto the open ground, and the wheat, watered by the dew and relieved of the weeds that had been stealing its ground and its moisture, straightened up in the sun and grew. That was the first thing. The weeds, and a man who bothered to look could have understood the first thing. It was the second and the third things that were the real secret, the things set down in the 3 lines of the old tongue at the bottom of the marked page. The second thing was the crust. That dry ground worked and worked with the harrow as the extension office taught, went to a fine loose dust on top, and when the rare rain came, the dust sealed over into a hard slick crust that shed the water off instead of drinking it in, so that half of what little rain fell ran away down the coulee and was lost. But where the sheep walked, the ground was different. 600 small sharp feet moving across the field morning after morning broke that slick sealed crust into a rough crumb, a surface pocked and broken and open, and the next rain did not run off the Rourke field. It sank in. And the sheep left another thing behind them. The plain, rich droppings of 600 grazing animals worked into that broken crust by those same feet, so that the ground where the band passed grew darker and softer and more alive by the week, while the clean harrowed fields all around went on baking to a pale, dead powder. And the third thing, the thing Della understood least and trusted most, the thing her grandmother had underlined so hard the pencil nearly tore the page, had to do with what slept in the ground. Because in that country, in the shallow, warm earth of the dry benches, a certain creature laid its eggs. It laid them in the fall, in the loose, undisturbed soil of a clean, tended field, packed close together in little chambers a few inches down. And there they slept through the winter and the spring, thousands upon thousands of them, waiting, and in a year, when the conditions were right, a dry year following a wet one. A year when the ground had been left clean and undisturbed and warm, they woke all at once and came up out of the earth by the millions, wingless and hungry and marching, and they ate the country bare. The old people had a name for them, and the new people had another, and the name did not matter. What mattered was that they laid their eggs in clean, undisturbed ground. And that ground, which had been walked, broken, crusted and recrusted, grazed and dunged and churned by the feet of a passing band, was not clean, undisturbed ground. It was hostile ground. It was, Amaya had written in her 3 underlined lines, ground where the sleepers could not sleep. Della did not know all of that in the clean, scientific way the college man would later put it. She knew it as her grandmother had known it, which was as a truth that was true because it had been watched over a life and set down. She knew that Amaya had walked her band through the standing grain in the years the neighbors did not, and that in the bad years, the marching years, that field had stood while the neighbors' fields went down. She knew that the 2 words the old shepherd had underlined so hard were a promise. And she knew that this dry summer, following as it did on a wet spring, with the ground baking and the old-timers muttering about how it favored a bad year long ago, was shaping up to be exactly the kind of year the page had been written for. She could not have said so to those laughing men at the store. She could barely say it to herself. But she felt it, as a person feels weather coming in the joints, and she walked her band, and she waited. The first summer ended with the harvest, and the harvest was where the laughing should have stopped and did not, because her wheat came in. Not spectacularly, that dry ground would never give a bumper crop, but it came in clean and sound and made a decent yield, better than decent for that bench in a dry year, better than several of the clean farmed fields down the valley that had been sprayed twice and harrowed till the topsoil blew. A reasonable man, seeing the Rourke wheat come off the field in good order after a whole summer of sheep walking through it, might have paused and scratched his head and wondered whether there was something to it after all. But those Kestrel regulars were not on this subject reasonable men. They had committed themselves to the joke. And a joke is a hard thing to climb down from in front of your friends. When the Rourke wheat came in, they did not scratch their heads. They said she had gotten lucky. Blind sow finds an acorn now and again, Halloran said at the counter, and it got its laugh, and the name held, and the second summer began exactly as the first had. With 600 sheep walking through the wheat before daylight, and the whole valley laughing. Della let them laugh. She had the harvest money, such as it was, and she made the bank payment with it, and she had a little over, and she bought tires for the truck at last, and a new pair of boots, and a sack of hard candy that she did not need, and ate slowly over a month like a woman who has decided to be a little kind to herself. And that fall she opened the oilcloth book, and in the back where empty pages remained. Writing in her own hand, in English only because the old tongue was beyond her to set down, she set down the weather of the year, and the weight of the lambs, and the yield of the wheat, as the grandmother had. And she felt as she wrote it that she had joined something, that she was a link now in a chain running back across an ocean and forward into a future she could not see, and it steadied her. She would need steadying, because the second summer was the hard one. The second summer was the dark night before the morning, and it very nearly took the place from her. It began with the extension man. The county extension office in those years was a proud and modern thing, staffed by young men fresh from the agricultural college, with their heads full of the new chemistry and the new machinery, and a boundless confidence that the old ways were dying, and good riddance to them. The agent for that district was named Pruitt, and he was not a bad young man, only a certain and a thorough one, and it was his job to drive the district and look at the farms and file reports on the condition of the land. One hot afternoon in the second summer, he drove his county car out the bench and up to the Rourke section to see for himself the thing the whole valley was laughing about. He found Della among the sheep, moving a few head that had drifted from the band, and he'd introduced himself politely and asked if he might look around, and she said he might, because she had nothing to hide, and because a small, hopeful part of her, a part she did not fully trust, wondered whether an educated man might be the one to finally see. He walked the field. He studied the wheat, and he studied the ground, and he studied the sheep, and he took a little notebook out of his shirt pocket and wrote in it, and his face, as he wrote, was the closed, careful face of one who has already made up his mind and is only gathering the evidence to prove himself right. "You are running these sheep on the wheat ground on purpose," he said. "I am, through the standing grain, before the sun," Della said. "When the wheat holds tight and the weeds stand up, the sheep take the weeds and leave the grain." "That's not possible," Pruitt said, pleasantly, writing. "Sheep are indiscriminate grazers. They'll take the wheat with everything else. Come out at first light and watch them," she said. "You can see it done in an hour." But he had no wish to come out before dawn and watch it done. He wanted to write his report. He asked her a few more questions about the timing and the numbers, and she answered them plainly, and she saw that he was not really listening to the answers, that he was fitting them into a shape he had already built. Then he closed the notebook and put it back in his pocket and delivered his verdict. Kindly, as Croft was kind. "I have to be plain with you, Miss Rourke," Pruitt said. "What you are doing here is a textbook case of overgrazing. The hoof action of that many animals on cropland is destroying your soil structure. You are mining the last of your fertility, and in a few years you will have nothing here but hardpan and dust. The wheat looks all right this season. You are living on borrowed ground." He glanced at his car. "I'll be filing a report. It's my job. I'd think hard if I were you about a different way of farming this section before it's too late to save it." "It is not too late to save it," Della said. "It is the only thing saving it. But you would have to kneel down in it to see, and you have your good trousers on." She said it without heat. Pruitt colored anyway and got into his county car and drove away down the bench in a plume of pale dust, and Della stood among her wheat with the dogs panting at her feet and felt the ground she had bet everything on shift a little under her. She could not have known it yet, but the caution she had held so hard for 2 summers the discipline of letting the ground make her case, had just met the one thing that discipline cannot beat, which is a man with a title and a report and the whole authority of the modern world behind him. Pruitt filed his report, and a report in a small valley does not stay in a drawer. The word of it moved through Pelican Valley as all words moved, through the feed store and the church and the grange, and it changed the shape of the joke. Before, she had been the sheep woman, a figure of fun, a widow who had gone a little strange, harmless. Now there was an official finding. Now the college itself, through its young man, had put it in writing that she was ruining her ground, and that gave the mockery a new and heavier weight, because now the crowd at the counter were not merely laughing. They were shaking their heads with the grave satisfaction of men proven right by the government. Halloran read the gist of the report aloud at the counter, or his version of it. "College says she's destroying the section," he announced. "Says it in writing. Says another few years and it'll be nothing but hardpan. I hate to see it, boys." He did not look like a man who hated to see it. "But you can't tell some people. You surely cannot tell a woman." Old Teague by the stove said it was a shame about the ground, that it had been good ground once. And a younger man, a fellow named Osgood who owed Croft money and knew which way the wind paid, said the neighborly thing would be for somebody to buy her out before she ruined it entire, and that he had heard Ansel Croft might be persuaded to do the valley that service. And Halloran laughed and said Ansel Croft never in his life needed persuading to buy good ground cheap, and the men laughed with him, and the word went round, and it reached Croft, who said nothing at all, only smiled his patient smile. Because a woman ruining her own ground under an official report was a woman whose land would come to him sooner and cheaper than he had dared to hope. Croft came to see her a week after the report. He arrived in the cool of the evening, in his clean-pressed clothes, with his good hat held to his chest, and he leaned on her gate and told her how sorry he was to hear about the trouble with the Extension office. "I've always admired your grit, Miss Rourke," Croft said. "I want you to know that." But a person has to know when a fight is lost. When even the college is telling you the ground is going under, that's not a thing one stubborn will can turn around. And then, for the first time, he named the number. He said it soft, in that reasonable evening voice. "I'll give you this for the section, all of it, the sheep too, if you want shut of them. It's more than the bank will leave you once they're through. It clears your debt and leaves you enough for a fresh start down in town, near your sister. There's no shame in it, none at all." Della stood on her side of the gate and looked at him a long time. The number was low. It was a cruel, low number dressed in a kind voice, and the cruelest part of it was that it was true, that it was more than the bank would leave her. That Ansel Croft was right about the arithmetic, and they both knew he was right. "I'll think on it," she said, because she could not trust herself to say anything else. "You do that," Croft said gently. "I'll leave the papers with you so you can look them over. No hurry." And he took a folded paper from inside his coat and laid it on the gatepost under a stone, and touched his hat, and went, and left her standing in the falling dark with the folded thing weighted on the post like a promise or a threat, she could not tell which. Then the weather turned on her, because when a thing has begun to go wrong, it does not usually go wrong by halves. 3 nights after Croft left his paper on the post, a hard, dry summer storm came off the rimrock without much warning. The kind that brings little rain and a great deal of wind and lightning, and it hit in the black hours before dawn while the band was still out on the range. Della woke to the thunder and knew before she was fully awake that it was trouble, and she was into her boots and her coat and out into it with a lantern that the wind kept trying to kill. The 2 dogs pressed against her legs and unwilling for once to leave her, and she found the range gate blown open and the band gone. 600 sheep scattered before a storm, run every direction into the dark across a country of coulees and cut banks and old wire, is a thing that can end an outfit in a single night. She knew it. She went after them anyway. She was out in that storm until well past first light, soaked through, her voice gone hoarse from calling the dogs over the wind, walking the coulees and the fence lines and finding them in 2s and 3s, and driving them back, and some she found down in a wash where a dozen had piled against a fence and 3 had smothered under the others, and some she did not find until the following day. And a handful she never found at all. When daylight came gray and wet on that second morning, she stood in the muddy range with the band gathered ragged and short and trembling around her, and she counted them the slow, careful way her grandmother had taught her, and the count came up short by more than a score of head, and each head was money she did not have. And she stood there in the mud with the count in her mouth like a stone. That was the morning the young dog would not come to her. He had run himself half to death in the storm, chasing sheep he could not see, and he had cut a foreleg badly on old wire down in the wash, and when Della came to him, he shied from her hand, wild-eyed and hurting, the training all gone out of him in his fear, and she had to sit down in the cold mud and wait him out, talking low, for the better part of an hour before he would let her near enough to see the leg. And sitting there in the mud with the ruined count and the hurt dog and Croft's folded paper waiting on the gatepost like a patient buzzard, Della came nearer to breaking than the storm had brought her, because a person can stand against the mockery of a whole valley for 2 years and then be undone by one frightened dog who will not come when called. She got him home. She wrapped the leg, and it healed crooked, and he was never quite the same working dog again, though he lived out his years by her stove, and she never once held the crooked leg against him, because he had run himself to pieces trying to do the thing she asked in the dark, and there is a loyalty in that which outweighs a straight leg. But the storm did its work on her spirit, coming as it did on top of the report and the price on the post. The extension man had said her ground was failing. The valley had laughed for 2 years. Croft had named a number she could not honestly call unfair. And now the weather itself seemed to have joined the argument against her, thinning her band and hurting her dog and washing 3 head dead into a coulee in a single night, as if to say that the whole world, the men and the government and the sky together, had agreed she was wrong. That was the night she came the closest she ever came to signing Croft's paper. She brought it into the house. She set it on the kitchen table. And it happened that the only thing at hand to weight it flat was the same river stone that held the herder's book, so that the 2 of them lay side by side under the lamp, the folded paper that would end it, and the cracked old book that had started it. And she sat down between them with a pen in her hand, an educated woman's pen with a good nib that had been her husband's. And she unfolded the paper and read it through, the low price and the fair-sounding words, and she set the nib against the line where her name would go, and she held it there. And she did not sign it. She would tell people later, the few she ever told, that she did not know exactly why she did not, only that as she held the pen there in the lamplight, her eye fell on the oilcloth book beside the paper, opened still to the page with the red flannel marker, and she read those two underlined words one more time, the two her grandmother had pressed so hard into the paper that they showed through from the back. And she thought of Amaya going up alone into the high pastures as a girl. She thought of the old shepherd running the outfit for 30 years and burying the husbands and keeping the book. She thought of all the men, over there and here both, who must have laughed at that old woman too, and how the old woman had walked her band and kept her field and set it all down in pencil for a granddaughter she would never meet, on the chance that the granddaughter might someday need it. And Della thought, if I sign this, that is finished. The chain breaks here, in my hand, in this kitchen. And she found that she could not be the one to break it, not because she was brave, she would say, because she was stubborn, and because she had inherited from the old shepherd a thing stronger than fear, which was the flat refusal to hand a proud man a thing he had not earned. She capped the pen. She folded Croft's paper back up, and she took the little book and turned to a blank page in the back, and in her own pencil, in the lamplight, with the ordinary summer crickets sawing away in the dark outside the window, she wrote one line. She wrote the date, and then she wrote, I did not sign it. And then she blew out the lamp and went to bed, and before the sun came up over the rimrock, she was out with the dogs, walking 600 sheep across her wheat one more dawn, just as the book said. That is the only place in this whole telling where those 3 words belong, and I have spent them now, and I will not spend them again. She did not know that the year the page had been written for was almost upon her, but it was. It had been building all along, out of sight, in the warm, shallow ground of every clean-tended field in the valley, and the wet spring before this dry summer had been the last thing it needed, and now, under the baking benches, a few inches down. In the loose, undisturbed soil of all those textbook-clean fields, the sleepers were nearly ready. Under every field, that is, except her own. The old-timers felt it first, as old-timers do. Old Teague, who by the stove had shaken his head over her ground, came into the feed store one morning that second summer while Halloran was in the middle of a sheep-woman remark, and the old man did not laugh. He set his coffee down on the counter and spoke to no one and everyone at once. The grass up high has a look I don't care for, Teague said. Ground's warm too early. I mind a year like this when I was a boy. He named a year far enough back that most of the loungers by the stove had not yet been born. You want to laugh, boys, he said. Get your laughing done now. What happened that year, old-timer? Halloran asked, grinning, playing to the stove. Teague looked at him a while before he answered. The country got ate, he said. Clean off. Every green thing from the rimrock to the river in about 3 days. My daddy walked off his place after and never farmed again. He picked up his coffee. You go on and laugh at the widow, he said. I've seen what she's afraid of. You haven't. And he went and sat by himself in the corner and said nothing else, and Halloran made a joke about the old man's memory, and a few of them chuckled, but it was a thinner laugh than before, and 1 or 2 of them did not join it. Ivers the clerk told Della about it that week, low over the counter, the whole of what Teague had said. And Della went home and took the herder's book down and turned to the years her grandmother had recorded, the long column of them running back before Della was born, and she ran her finger down the column until she found the year old Teague had named. And beside that year in Amaya's crab pencil was a single word in the old tongue, a word that appeared beside only the very worst years. And Della had learned by then to know it on sight. It was the word for the marching. She stood a long time at the table with the book open. Then she went out and looked at her band, 600 head grazing quiet on the range in the evening light, and she looked at her wheat coming golden in the field where their feet had walked. And she looked out across the fences at the clean pale fields of her neighbors, harrowed to dust, sprayed twice, textbook perfect, and something turned over in her chest like a key in a lock, and she understood that the marking year, the one the whole page pointed toward, was almost here, and that everything now depended on whether Amaya had been right. She walked the band one more dawn. And then another. And then the morning came. It came as the worst things come, on an ordinary day that gave no warning. It was late in the second summer, the wheat gone gold and heavy in the head, and near to cutting all across the valley, the finest-looking crop the valley had put up in years on the clean farmed ground, everyone pleased, everyone counting the yield in their heads. Everyone but the dried-up old man in the corner of the feed store. The morning came up hot and still and yellow, the air dead and heavy as it gets before a change, and up under the rimrock, in the warm, shallow ground of the high benches where the sleeping had been longest and deepest, the earth came alive. They boiled up out of the earth all at once. Just as her grandmother had written that they would, wingless and pale at first, and then darkening as they hardened in the sun, thousands and then hundreds of thousands, and then a number past any counting, and they began to march. They did not fly. That was the terrible strangeness of it, the thing that men who had only heard of such years could not have pictured. They marched, a solid moving carpet of them, all in one direction, down off the high ground and into the valley. And where they passed, they left nothing, not a green blade, not a leaf, not a standing weed, only bare stalk and stripped stem and dust, as though a fire had gone through that gave no smoke. From a distance, from the bench road where Della stood that morning with the dogs, it did not look like insects at all. It looked as though the ground itself were moving, as though the skin of the high country had come loose and was sliding down into the valley, a glittering, shifting gray tide that caught the hard yellow light and dimmed it, so that the sun over the rimrock went pale and strange. And there was a sound coming off it, carried on the dead-still air, a dry rushing rattle like a million tiny jaws all working at once, which is exactly what it was. The valley went into a kind of madness for 3 days. The men who had spent 2 summers laughing came out of their houses that first morning and saw the gray tide pouring down out of the high country toward their beautiful clean fields, and they did every desperate thing a person does. They ran for the sprayers. They mixed the poison in the drums with the skull on the label and went at the marching tide with everything they had. And it was like spitting at a river. They dug trenches to turn the march as a man might turn a flood. And the crickets filled the trenches with their own crawling bodies until the ones behind marched across the backs of the ones in front. They set fires. They beat at the ground with wet sacks. They stood in their own fields, grown men, and watched 2 summers and a whole year's hope and the bank payment and the children's shoes go down into that gray moving carpet in an afternoon, and some of them wept, and there is no shame in the telling of it, because a man watching his living eaten in front of him has earned the right to weep. Osgood, who had joked at the Grange dance about whether the sheep danced, stood in the middle of his own ruined wheat on the second morning of the marching with a fence post in his two hands, swinging it at the crawling ground like a man gone out of his mind, beating the crickets to paste by the hundred, while 10,000 more poured over the wreck of the ones he had killed, and a neighbor who came by later swore he heard Osgood talking to them while he swung, cursing them and then begging them and then just making a sound that was not words at all. It did no good. Nothing did any good. A grown man could kill a bushel of them in an hour, and it was less than nothing. It was a teaspoon dipped from a river, and by noon Osgood sat down in his own bare dirt with the post across his knees and did not get up for a long while. Pell lost every acre and did not fight it. He had seen enough of the old ways to know a thing that could not be fought, and he stood by his own gate on the first day and watched the tide come and take it. And when his wife came out and asked him what they were going to do, Pell said, "Nothing. There's nothing to do. You don't fight the ocean." And then he said a thing his wife repeated at the church for years afterward. He looked out across his stripped and ruined ground toward the east bench, where a single field still stood gold in the wrong-looking sun, and he said, "The widow knew. The sheep woman knew, and we laughed at her for 2 years, and she knew." And he took off his hat and stood there bareheaded. Whether in grief or in some rough beginning of respect his wife could not say, and maybe he could not have said either. Down at the feed store, Halloran stood in his own doorway on the second day and watched the tide come across the flat toward the town, and there was no comedy left in him at all. A neighbor found him there and said something, and Halloran did not answer. And the neighbor said afterward that in 30 years he had never once seen the man at the counter with nothing to say. And the tide came on, down through the valley, field by clean field, and it ate them all. It ate the fine crop on the church glebe, it ate Osgood's wheat, and it ate Pell's, and it ate its way across 3 sides of Ansel Croft's holdings. Across the harrowed, clean farm benches he had sprayed twice, and left them stripped to bare dirt, 30 miles of ruin, every clean field the valley had. Every field but hers. Now here is the thing to hold, the whole reason for the telling, and it is best seen not from Della's side of the fence, but from Croft's, because that was where the men of the valley stood when they finally understood. Ansel Croft came up the bench on the second day of the marching in his good truck, with the gray tide behind him having already taken the last of his high ground, and he came, though he would not have said so to a living soul, to watch the sheep woman go under along with everyone else. He came to see the crickets take the one field in the valley he most wanted for himself, so that he might go to her that evening in his clean clothes, hat held humbly against his coat, and name a price lower than the last one, and take the ground at last. He drove up the bench road with the rattle of the marching filling the whole world, and he stopped his truck at the fence line where his ruined ground met hers, and he got out and he looked across the fence. And on the far side of Ansel Croft's fence there was wheat, standing wheat, ripe, gold, heavy-headed, whole full field of it, unbroken, the finest-looking grain in the county, standing untouched in the one place the gray tide had not been able to go. The marching had swept down out of the high benches and reached the edge of the Rourke section the same as it reached every other field. And it had come up against the ground her sheep had walked, the broken, crusted, grazed, and dunged living soil where no sleeper had been able to sleep and lay its eggs, and there had been almost nothing there to hatch. And what little came marching from the edges and tried to cross that churned, dark, broken surface found no clean, warm bedding ground to breed its numbers. And the great tide did what water does at a wall it cannot climb. It went around. It split at the edge of her field like a river splitting at a stone, and passed down both sides of her section, and joined again below, and left the wheat in the middle standing, untouched, gold, the only grain left upright for 30 miles in any direction a man cared to look. Ansel Croft stood at his own fence in his ruined field with the rattle of his own destruction still going on behind him, and he looked at that standing gold wheat a long time, and no word came to him. There was nothing to say. Every clean textbook belief he had held his whole life, everything he had taught his son, and everything Pruitt had written in his report, and every laugh that had ever come out of the door of the Kestrel feed store lay stripped to bare stalk and dust behind him. And the one thing that stood was the thing they had all agreed was ruin, the sheep woman's wheat. Walked and cropped and crusted by 600 head of the animal, a serious man does not run, exactly as a dead woman had set down in pencil in a cracked oilcloth book more than 50 years before. He got back in his truck after a while and drove down the bench, and that evening he did not go to her with a lower price. He did not go to her at all. It would be a long while before Ansel Croft could bring himself to stand at Delarourke's gate again, and when at last he did, it would not be to buy anything. Della had watched all of it from her own side, from the little rise behind the house where she could see the field and the fence and the gray tide splitting around her ground. She had not slept in 2 days. She had done the only thing there was to do, which was nothing, which was to stand and watch and hold still, because there was no fighting a thing like that, and the only defense had already been built, dawn by dawn, over 2 summers of walking a band through the grain. She watched the tide split at her fence and go around, and she watched her wheat stand, and she neither shouted nor wept. And she did not, then or ever, drive down to the Kestrel to stand in the door and tell the men what they could do with their sprayers. That scene does not happen in this story. There is no moment where the sheep woman gloats. She stood on the rise with the dogs beside her and the terrible rattle filling the air, and she watched her grandmother's page come true. And after a while she went down to the house and carried the little book out and opened it where the red flannel lay, and she stood there in the field with the book open in her hard hands, and she spoke the 2 underlined words out loud, at last, to the only audience that had ever mattered, which was the dead woman who had written them. The 2 words were these: "They will." That was all. 2 words, underlined twice, bitten deep into the page. Amaya had set them there a lifetime before, above the diagrams and the timing and those 3 crabbed lines of Basque about the sleepers in the earth, and she had meant them as a promise across the years to whoever came after and was patient enough to read them. They will. They will laugh. They will call you strange. They will send the man with the report and the man with the price. They will do all of it, every time, in every valley, because that is what people do to a person who keeps a thing they have decided is worthless. And then the hard year will come, the marching year, the year the page was written for, and the ground will settle the argument as the ground always does. And every field will go down but yours. They will. Della read the two words aloud in her standing field with the ruin all around her, and then she closed the book, and she went in and slept for 14 hours, and when she woke the crickets had passed on down the valley, and the sun came up ordinary above the rock, and her wheat still stood. It was 3 weeks before the first of them came to the fence. You might think it would have been quick, that the men who had laughed would have come the very next day to say they were sorry. But that is not how pride works, and this story has always been more honest about pride than a person might like. Pride does not turn on a dime. The men of the valley spent those 3 weeks in a stunned and shuffling silence, salvaging what little could be salvaged, filing for what help there was, and not one of them could yet bring himself to drive up the bench and stand at the sheep woman's gate, because to do that was to say out loud the thing they had all just learned, which was that she had been right and they had been fools. And a man will do almost anything before he will say that. So they waited and let the silence do their apologizing for a while, as men do. The one who came first was not a man at all, or not yet. He was a boy. He was Ansel Croft's own son, a boy of maybe 16 named Tomas, and he came up the bench road on foot one evening at dusk, which was the hour Della was out with the band. And he waited at the fence and did not come through the gate, and he held his hat to his chest, the same gesture his father made, only on the boy it was not a manner. It was the real thing. Della saw him from the field and finished what she was doing without hurry, and then she walked over to the fence with the dogs at her heel and stood on her side of it and looked at the boy and waited. Because she had learned that the person who speaks first in such a moment gives the other one room, and the boy needed room. "Ma'am," Tomas said, and then he could not go on for a moment, and he looked down at the hat he was turning, and then he looked back up at her and got it out all in a rush. "My father didn't send me," Tomas said. "He doesn't know I'm here." Della did not say anything. She looked at the boy across the fence, at Croft's own face gone young and open and ashamed in the boy's face, and she waited, and Tomas gathered himself and went on. "I saw your field," he said. "Everybody's seen your field. The whole valley's seen it. My father won't talk about it. He won't talk about anything at all since the crickets. But I keep thinking about it, ma'am. I keep thinking how they went around your ground. I have to know how you did it. Nobody will say. They all still call you the sheep woman, even now, even after, and I don't understand how they can, after what everybody saw with their own eyes." He stopped. His voice had gone thick. "I want to learn it," he said. "Whatever it is you did, I want you to teach me. I don't care what my father says. I want to know the right way to farm this ground, and it's plain to me now that you're the only one in this whole valley who does." And that, in the end, was the vindication. Not the apology, though the apologies came. Not Croft at the gate, though he came too, in time. It was the boy at the fence at dusk, with his hat clutched against his shirt, asking to be taught. Because a boy asking to be taught is the future changing its mind, and that is worth more than any number of grown men saying they were sorry. Della opened the gate. "Come in out of the road, then," she said, "and leave that hat on your head. You'll want both hands." And she let him through, and she took him out into the field, and she showed him the wheat standing gold and whole, and then she did something that told the boy more than any words could have. She knelt down in the field, right down on her knees, in the broken living crumb of the grazed ground. And she took up a fistful of it and held it out to him. "Feel that," she said. "Go on. Work it in your fingers." Tomas crouched and took the dark soil and rolled it in his hand, uncertain. "Now go put your hand through the fence there," Della said, "and take up a handful of your daddy's ground on the other side, and tell me the difference." The boy reached through the wire and scraped up a palmful of the neighbor ground and brought it back, and it ran through his fingers, pale and fine and dead as ash, and he looked from the one hand to the other, the dark living crumb and the pale dust, and his mouth came open a little. "They're not the same dirt at all," Tomas said. "They started the same," said Della. "The difference is 600 sheep and 2 years." And she began to tell him, kneeling there beside the boy in the grain, about the weeds and the dew and the hour before the sun, about the crust that the little sharp feet broke open so the rain could sink in, about the droppings worked down into the soil, the ground going darker and richer by the week. And when she came to the last thing, the sleepers, she told him that too, in plain words a boy could follow, how the crickets bedded their eggs in clean, quiet ground and could not bed them in ground that had been walked and broken and churned. "So the crickets couldn't lay in your field," Tomas said slowly, working it out. "And where they did lay, on Daddy's clean ground, that's where they all came up from. That's the whole of it," Della said. "That is the entire secret, and it took the valley 2 years and a cricket year to be worth telling to. Your daddy sprays his ground clean and quiet and warm, which is exactly the bed the crickets want. I walk mine rough and broken, which is a bed they can't use. He was making their nursery. I was breaking it." She stood and brushed her knees. "It isn't magic. It's just looking at the ground from down here instead of from up on a horse." They walked back up to the house as the dark came on, and there Della did a thing she had not done for anyone in the valley in 2 years. She lifted the herder's book down off the table and set it in front of the boy under the lamp and turned it to the flannel-marked page, and she let him see the diagrams and the timing and the 3 crabbed lines of Basque. And she told him about Amaya, about the old shepherd climbing alone to the high pastures as a girl in a country across the ocean, about the 30 years and the buried husbands and the book that had crossed an ocean and been right about a cricket year 50 years before it came. "You mean your grandmother knew," Thomas said, staring at the little penciled arrows, "all this time. She wrote down how to beat the crickets before you were even born." "She wrote down how to farm," Della said. "The crickets are just the year it showed. Most years it only makes better wheat and less work. It's only the marching year that makes it look like a miracle." She turned the book so he could see the 2 words penciled bold across the top. "Read that," she said. The boy read the 2 underlined words. "They will," he said. "They will what?" "Everything," Della said. "They will laugh. They will send the government man. They will circle your land and wait for you to fail. And then comes the marching year, and it settles everything." She knew all of that, too. She knew what people are. She wasn't only teaching me sheep, and Tomas listened as Della herself had once listened at the old shepherd's knee, completely like a person who is going to carry a thing forward, and when he left that night. Walking back down the bench in the dark, he was not the same boy who had walked up, and the valley, though it did not know it yet, was not going to be the same valley. The grown men came after that, 1 and 2 at a time, over the fall. It is worth telling how they came, because there is a decency in it that the laughing years might make a person forget the valley was capable of. They did not come all at once, and they did not come easy. A man would drive up the bench on some invented errand to return a borrowed thing or ask about a strayed cow. And he would get to talking, awkward, at the gate, and somewhere in the awkwardness he would get around to the field, and to the crickets, and to the thing he had come up the bench to say and could barely say. Pell was among the first. He drove up with a length of fence wire he claimed he had borrowed from her husband years back and never returned, which everyone, including Pell, knew was a lie. And he leaned on the gate and turned the wire over in his hands and finally said, looking at the field and not at her, "That's the only wheat in the valley, Miss Rourke." "I know it," Della said. "I lost all of mine, every acre. I sprayed it twice. I know that too. I'm sorry for it." Pell looked at her then, surprised. "You've no cause to be sorry for me," he said. "I was down at the store laughing with the rest of them. 2 summers. He worked the wire in his hands. "I've a boy your Tomas's age," he said, meaning the Croft boy. Everyone already knew the boy came to her. "I'd take it kindly if sometime you'd let him come up and see how it's done. He'll inherit my ground, God willing, and I'd sooner he learned it right than learned it off me." "Send him up," Della said. "Any morning at first light. He'll want to be here before the sun." And Pell nodded and set the wire on her gate-post, the wire he had not borrowed, as a kind of payment for a thing that had no price, and drove back down the bench. Old Teague came too, and his was the visit that stayed with her longest, because Teague had never laughed. He drove up slow in a truck older than her own, and got out stiff and leaned on the gate a while looking at the standing wheat, and Della came over and the pair of them looked at it together in silence for a good long spell, an old man and a young widow, neither of them in any hurry. Which is a kind of understanding that does not need speaking. "My daddy walked off his place after a year like this one," Teague said at last. 19 and hardly a boy I was, and I watched him do it. He never said why. He just come in from the field one evening with his hat in his hand and told my mother to pack, and we went, and he never farmed again, and he never spoke of it, and he drank after that, some, and died down in the flats doing another man's fence work. Teague was quiet. "I've carried that year my whole life," he said. "I've watched the ground every spring since, waiting on it to come again. And it come. And I knew it was coming. I told those fools at the store it was coming, and I still lost my crop the same as everybody, because knowing it's coming don't save you. Only one thing saved anybody." He turned and looked at her. "You want to tell me my daddy could have kept his place if he'd known what you know? If he'd had that book of your grandmother's?" Della thought about how to answer that, because it was no small question. It was a whole ruined life leaning on it. "I think a band of sheep and the patience to walk them would have saved your daddy's wheat." She said carefully, "I do think that. But I don't think it would have saved him from being laughed at first, and being laughed at for years before the year came to prove him right, and not every man can carry that, and I'll not fault the ones who can't. It's a heavy thing to be right alone." She paused. "Your daddy wasn't weak. He was early. He didn't have a grandmother's book, and he didn't have 50 years of somebody's watching to lean on. I had that. It's the only reason I stood where he fell. So don't you carry it as his failing. Carry it as bad luck that he came to the hard year with empty hands." The old man's jaw worked, and he looked back out at the wheat, and after a moment he bared his head and held the hat against him. An old man standing bareheaded in the cold at a widow's fence, and he said, "Lo, that's a kinder telling of it than I've give myself in 50 years." And that was all. He put his hat back on and got into the old truck and drove off. And Della stood at the gate and watched him go and had to blink hard a time or two, because she had not saved only her own wheat, she saw then. She had, without meaning to, handed an old man away to lay down a thing he had carried since he was a boy, and that was worth as much as the crop or more. Halloran was among the very last, which surprised no one, because a man who has built himself a throne out of small talk at a feed store counter has the furthest to climb down. But he came. He drove up one gray November afternoon and sat in his truck a while at the gate before he could bring himself to get out, and when he got out he did not have his hat to his chest. That was not his way, but he stood there with his bald head bare in the cold. And he said the thing straight out, which a person had to credit him for. "I was wrong," Halloran said. "I was wrong for 2 years. I stood behind that counter and I told the whole valley you'd gone strange, and I made a comedy of you, and I coined that name and I kept it going for 2 summers running, and I was wrong the entire time." He looked out at the field. "That's the finest stand of wheat in this county," he said. "It's the only stand of wheat in this county. And I called you the sheep woman and made the valley laugh at it." He was quiet a moment. "I don't reckon there's a way to take a thing like that back." "There isn't," Della agreed. "But you drove up here and said it to my face, which is more than most men would do. That counts for something." "Does it?" "It counts for a great deal," she said. "The saying of it behind my back is what you did the other thing with. This is the harder direction to drive." And Halloran gave a short, surprised breath that was almost a laugh, the first honest sound she had ever heard out of him, and he put his hand across the gate. "I reckon that's a name to be proud of now," he said. "Sheep woman. I reckon I'd be honored if my own place ever looked half like yours." And Della, who did not hold a grudge because holding a grudge was a use of strength she had never been able to afford, took his hand and shook it. And that was the end of the joke that had run for 2 summers, ended by the man who had started it standing bareheaded at her gate in the November cold. Ansel Croft was the very last, and he came in the deep of the winter, and he did not come to buy. He came in the cold and the early dark in his clean clothes, and he stood at the gate with his good hat held to his chest, and for a long moment the two of them only looked at each other across the wire. The patient man who had circled her land for years, and the woman who had refused. Twice and 3 times to hand it to him. And then Ansel Croft said the thing he had come to say, which cost him more to come and say than anything he had ever said in his life, because he was a proud man and a smooth man, and never in his life had he had to stand out in the winter dark and admit he had been beaten by a widow and a flock of sheep. "My boy talks about you," Croft said. "At my own table. He talks about your field and your grandmother's book and how you get down in the dirt with him to show him things. He stopped listening to me about the ground, Miss Rourke. He listens to you now." Croft turned his hat slowly in his hands, and Della understood in that moment where the boy had learned the gesture. "I came up here 3 or 4 times to buy this section off you," he said. "You know I did. I named you prices I'm ashamed of. I stood right here at this gate the night the report came out, and I named you a number to your face when you were as low as I've ever seen a person, and I did it on purpose because I knew you were low, and I wanted the ground. I know why you did it," Della said. "I never held it against you especially. You wanted the coulee bottom. It's good ground. A man's supposed to want good ground." "A man's not supposed to want it that way," Croft said. "Cheap off a widow in her worst hour with the government helping me do it." He made himself look at her. "And I'd have gotten it, too, another season, and the bank would have had you, and I'd have picked it up for a song, and I'd have run cattle on it and sprayed it clean, and it would have gone down to dust with the rest of the valley this year. And I'd never once have known any different. So I've come up here in the cold to tell you that you did me a kindness by beating me. And I never thought I'd say such a thing to any living soul. But there it is. I've said it, and now I'll go." But Della did not let him go, not quite yet. "You'll come in first," she said, "and warm up and see the book. Your boy's seen it." It seems to me a father ought to see what his son is learning. And Croft stood there a moment as if she had struck him, and then something in the smooth, patient face came loose, and he took off his hat for real, and came through the gate, and hung his coat by the door, and sat down at the kitchen table where the folded price paper had once lain under the river stone. And Della set the little book in front of him and opened it where the red flannel lay, and told him about Amaya, and let him read the 2 words penciled bold across the top. They will. Ansel Croft sat a long time over the book, this proud, beaten man in the widow's warm kitchen, and once he put his finger very lightly on the little pencil arrows as though he could feel through them the hand that had drawn them. And when he finally rose to leave, he shook her hand and thanked her, and there was never again any talk between them of a fair price. And the fence between their 2 places from that winter on was only a fence. The State Agricultural College came in the spring. It came in the person of a man named Oakes, a professor older than Pruitt, with gray in his mustache and a genuine curiosity the young agent had lacked, and he came because the story had traveled, as such a story will, out of the valley and down to the college. The story of the one field that stood in the cricket year. Oakes was the kind of scientist who, hearing a story like that, does not laugh and does not file a report, but drives out to see for himself and asks to be shown. He walked the field with Della. He knelt in the soil the same as she had knelt with the boy, and he took the dark living crumb of the grazed ground and worked it in his fingers and studied it a long while. He turned his eyes to the fence line where her ground met the neighbor's, the sharp line between the churned dark soil and the pale dead dust, and he grew very quiet. "I have read Pruitt's report," Oakes said at last. "I read it before I came up. It says you are destroying this section through overgrazing." He rolled the dark soil in his palm. "Miss Rourke, in 30 years of studying dryland soils, I have rarely put my hand into better ground than this, and I have never once seen a line as sharp as that fence line, and I would very much like to understand what I am looking at. If you would be willing to teach an old man something his own colleague missed, come out before the sun tomorrow," Della said, "and watch the sheep go through, and you'll understand the half of it standing up. The other half is in a book, and I'll show you that after." So Oakes came out at first light and watched the band move through the grain in the gray. Watched the sheep take the tops off the weeds and leave the low wet wheat, watched 600 feet break the crust of the ground. And he understood, being a man whose whole training was in understanding, exactly what his young colleague had failed to understand, which was that he was looking at a thing that worked. He came back many times over the next years. He brought students. He measured things, the moisture held in the soil and how heavy the grain came in, and he did the one measurement that settled it beyond all argument. He dug little squares of soil on both sides of the fence and sifted them for the crickets' eggs, and where the clean fields held their thousands of eggs to the square yard, packed close in their little chambers, Della's ground held almost none, because there had been no clean, quiet, undisturbed bedding for the laying, exactly as Amaya had set down in her 3 lines of the old tongue. And in time, Oakes wrote it up, in a bulletin the college published, in the careful language of science, and he gave the folk thing a proper name, as a college always does, and called it a system of integrated range and grain management. And he wrote that the practice had been observed on the Rourke place in Pelican Valley, and that it appeared to offer real protection against soil crusting and against the periodic outbreaks of the migratory insect, and it was read by men at other colleges in other dry states, and it spread. But Oakes did a thing that not every scientist would have done, and it is the reason his name belongs in this story alongside the others. When he wrote the bulletin, he did not write it up as his own discovery, as a lesser man might have. He put Della's name in it, plainly, as the source. And when Della, sitting across the kitchen table from him one evening as he made his notes, told him that it was not her discovery at all, that every bit of it had come out of an old book written by a woman he would never meet, and brought the herder's book to the table and showed him, Oakes did a thing that made Della have to turn and look out the dark window a moment to keep her composure. He took out his pen. "Tell me her name," he said very seriously. "The woman who wrote this. Tell me her name and how it is spelled and where she was born." And Della told him, and Oakes wrote it down in his own notes. The old shepherd's name, spelled out careful and correct, and he told Della that when the bulletin was reprinted, as he expected it would be, he would see the practice credited to its true origin, to the old country and the old shepherd and the 50 years of watching set down in pencil. "A thing like this doesn't come from a college," Oakes said. "It never does. It comes from somebody standing in the same field for 50 years with their eyes open, and then it comes to a college, and the college puts a long name on it and takes the credit. Not this time. Not while I've a pen." And he kept his word. In the reprinting there is a line, in the dry, careful language of an agricultural bulletin, that names the old shepherd, the Basque woman, and calls her the originator of the method. And it is the only place in all the written record of this world that her name appears. And it is there because a granddaughter had the patience to read what she had written, and a professor had the decency to write down where it came from. The college held a field day the next summer out on the Rourke bench, a thing the college did to spread a good practice to the farmers of a district, and the notice for it was printed up on a handbill and posted around the valley. And it happened, whether by the college's design or by plain chance, that one of those handbills went up in the window of the kestrel, tacked to the frame beside the door, at the very counter where the laughing had started 2 years before. Della saw it herself when she came in for salt one afternoon. The printed notice inviting the farmers of the district to come out and see the range and grain practice demonstrated on the place of Della Rourke. And she stood a moment looking at her own name in print in that window, and beside her, weighing out the salt, the young man who had taken the counter after Halloran said, not knowing quite what he was saying to whom, that folks were making a real fuss over that sheep business out east, and that he supposed there must be something to it after all. Della paid for her salt and said that she supposed there must be, and carried it out to the truck, and if she smiled at all, it was only after the door had shut behind her, because a person does not gloat. But a person is also allowed, once quietly, in the cab of her own truck, to feel the full weight of a thing turning all the way around. The field day itself drew better than anyone expected. They came from up and down the valley and from 2 counties over, farmers and ranchers, and a few of the young men from the college. And they stood in the dawn cool along Della's fence and watched her send the dogs and move the band across the wheat and the gray, and Oakes talked to them as it happened, explaining in his careful words what their own eyes were seeing, the sheep taking the weeds and sparing the wheat, the broken, living crust underfoot. And when a heavy-set rancher near the front, a doubting sort, with his arms crossed, said aloud that he still did not see how a body kept the sheep off the grain itself. Della, who had not meant to say anything, found the words coming out of her before she could stop them. "You don't keep them off it," she said, and the men turned to look. "You trust them on it at the right hour when the grain lies down and the weeds stand up. The animal will do the sorting for you if you give her the dark and the dew to do it in. The trouble was never the sheep. The trouble was always the hour a man was willing to get out of bed. A silence held over the fence line, and then old Teague, who had come to every gathering on that bench since the cricket year like a man attending church, gave his short, dry laugh from the back and said that she had just told them in one breath what the college had taken a whole bulletin to say, and the men laughed too. But it was a different laugh now, a laugh with her in it and not at her, and Della understood that the sound of a valley laughing, which had been the worst sound in the world to her for 2 years, could also be the best, depending on which side of it a person stood. The method spread through the valley over the years that followed, slowly, as a true thing spreads, farm by farm. As the men watched the Rourke place come through the dry years standing while their own ground blew, and one by one they came, not to laugh now but to learn, and they knelt in the field and took the crumb of soil in their hands and went home, and opened their gates and moved their own bands through their own grain before the sun. Tomas Croft grew up and took over his father's outfit and ran sheep with the cattle and walked them through the wheat, and his fields, in the next hard year that came, stood green when others went down, and there was no laughing about it at all by then. It was simply how a wise man farmed that ground. The feed store, under a younger man after Halloran retired, began to stock the things a person needed to run a mixed outfit, and a stranger passing through and asking directions to the Rourke place was no longer told to follow the laughing. He was told, with respect, that the Rourke place was up east on the bench, and that if he was interested in the range and grain business, he could not do better than to go up and ask the woman there to show him her book. Della Rourke ran that place the rest of her long life, and she never got rich. That dry ground would never make a person rich, but she never lost it either, and she never again had to sit at the kitchen table with a folded price paper under the lamp. She kept the band. She walked them through the grain every year before the sun stood over the rimrock. And every fall she opened the herder's book and set down the weather of the year, the lambing weights, the yield of the wheat, in her own pencil, in the back pages behind her grandmother's, adding her links to the chain. Thomas Croft's own children came up to learn from her when they were old enough, and she knelt in the grain with them as she had knelt with their father. And she showed them the book and read them the 2 words her grandmother had underlined, and when at last she grew too old to walk the band herself, she did not sell the place to a stranger, nor did she let it go to the bank. She left it, the ground and the flock and the oilcloth book together, to the one of the Croft children who had sat stillest and listened hardest, a solemn, watchful girl. The kind adults forget is in the room, because Della had recognized in that child the thing her own grandmother had once recognized in her, and she meant the chain to go on. She did not leave it to the boy who wanted a tractor and a career in town. She left it to the child who could kneel in a field and be quiet and read the ground and wait. There is one of these stories in every dry valley in the country if a person knows to look for it. Somewhere behind every piece of ground that stands green in the year everything else goes down, there is a person who kept a thing the neighbors laughed at, and a book or a memory or a habit handed down from someone older and wiser and long in the grave. And a hard year that finally settled the argument. The names change, and the animal changes, and the disaster changes, crickets in one valley and drought in the next, and the grasshopper year on the high plains beyond, but the shape of it is always the same, and the lesson is always the same, and it is not really a lesson about sheep or wheat or crickets at all. It is a lesson about patience, and about honoring the ones who came before you, and about the particular quiet courage it takes to keep faith with a thing you believe is true when the whole world has agreed, loudly and at length, that you have gone strange. If you have ever brought back a way of doing things that everyone around you had told you to leave behind, if you have kept faith with a grandmother's pencil or a father's habit or an old book the modern world had written off, if you were ever the sheep woman in your own valley and lived long enough to see the hard year prove you right, then this story has been for you, and this channel exists for you. And I would count it a kindness if you would stay a while and hear the next one. Leave a word below and tell us the name of the valley or the county of the little dry town you come from, wherever it was the ground finally settled an argument, because there is one of these stories in every one of them, and we are trying, one telling at a time, to write the old women back into the record where they belong. The oilcloth book is still out there, somewhere, being filled in. That is the thing to hold. At the end, not the crickets and not the ruined fields of the men who laughed, but the book, cracked and brown, passed down and still being written in, one careful pencil line a year, the weather and the lambs and the yield, by hands that learned it from hands that learned it from a shepherd who walked her band up into high pastures alone as a girl in a country across the ocean, and who set it all down on the chance that someone someday would have the patience to read it. They will laugh at you. And then the hard year will come, and every field will go down but yours. She wrote it in pencil, underlined twice, more than 100 years ago now, and it is still true, and it will be true in your valley too, whatever your valley is. That is the whole of it, and it is enough.